Thank you for joining us for the panel entitled Overcoming Political Obstacles to Building Communities of Belonging. I am Kevin Appleby of the Center for Migration Studies, and I'll serve as the moderator this evening. We have a distinguished panel of guests this afternoon or evening, depending on where you are. I know it's still afternoon in Albuquerque and El Paso. So let me introduce our guests for the panel. First is Mr. Denis McDonough, who is the Professor of Practice of Public Policy at the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame. Professor McDonough served as President Obama's Chief of Staff in the White House from February 2013 to January 2017. The Honorable Tim Keller has served as the Mayor of Albuquerque, New Mexico since December 2017. He also served as the state senator in New Mexico and as the New Mexico State Auditor. Mayor Keller is a graduate of Notre Dame. And we've just been joined by the Honorable Donald D. Margo, who has served as the Mayor of El Paso, Texas since June of 2017. He served in the Texas House of Representatives and currently serves as Vice Chair of Security for the U.S. Conference of Mayors and co-chair of the Mayors Conference COVID-19 Response and Health Equity Working Group. Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you for your time today. You each will have 2 minutes and no interrupting each other. No, sorry, wrong debate, wrong debate.
It didn't work the first time.
A little humor to start us off. A program note, Professor McDonough and Mayor Keller must leave at 6:30 for other commitments. So if you have questions for them, I suggest that you put them in the Q&A box starting now. And then we'll have the second half hour for questions from Mayor Margo. So Professor McDonough, let me start with you. Thank you for being with us. As you know, the working relationship between the federal government and local jurisdictions, including cities, has become highly politicized in recent years, mainly over the issue of immigration enforcement. This has poisoned the well, if you will, between some jurisdictions in Washington. One of the casualties of this debate has been the ability of different levels of government, both cities, local jurisdictions, and the federal government to work together to foster immigrant integration, assisting immigrants to become full members of our nation. Could you tell us, in your opinion, what can be done to improve the working relationship between the federal government and cities to work on an issue like the integration of immigrants into society? What steps can the federal government take to improve that relationship?
Well, Kevin, thanks so much. I'm really happy to be here. Congratulations to Therese and to the whole team for putting together a very, what looks to be a great agenda on several days of really important and timely work. You're also good to call on me as the staff guy before you call on the two elected members who actually have authority to do things. So mayors, it's really good to be with you too. So thanks for the chance. Look, I think, first of all, I think it's really important for us to understand that there's a role for everybody to play in improving the environment that shapes this cooperation or lack thereof. And what I mean by that is to say that the history of migration, the history of, for example, refugee policy in the United States is much more bipartisan and much more cooperative than has been the case over the course of these last several years. And so I guess my first point, Kevin, is to say, those of us who believe in the importance of migration ought not put our light under the bushel. We should put our light on top of the bushel and make our arguments for the importance of immigration to the U.S. national interest and to the common good. The example I use here is that just last year there was a big debate. Now this is a federal state rather than federal city debate, but a big debate about whether governors should go ahead and exercise the option granted to them by the Trump administration executive order that would have limited, given governors and county executives the right to limit resettlement of refugees in their states or in their counties. Overwhelmingly, until that executive order was struck by federal district court, by the way, as being inconsistent with the Constitution. But even before that, upwards of 40 plus states said they would not use that authority. Republicans and Democrats saying that actually a resettlement of refugees in their jurisdiction was a positive thing. It was just Texas that at the last minute made a decision, and many of the cities in Texas objected to that. So that's the first big point, which is there's a role for all of us here to underscore to policymakers at the federal, state, and local levels that immigration, and as you just argued, integration of immigrants is a national priority. Second thing is just on environment and tone. That argument that I've just talked about will go a long way to, I think, lowering the temperature between cities and the federal government when everybody is making an argument that safe migration, orderly migration is in the national interest. I think that will bring the temperature way down. Third is on enforcement. We spent a lot of time focusing on enforcement for priority removal of immigrants who are criminal threats to their communities. There ought to be a better way, and there has in the past been a better way to prioritize such removals, focusing on shared and common concern and shared and common threats. Then the last 2 points are just this. One, we have to focus on integration. I think everybody on this panel can give a story about what their forebears faced when they came to this country. I know my 4 grandparents, they didn't settle in South Boston because, that was their choice among many. They settled in South Boston because that was their only choice. We have to get better about integration as a general matter. And then the last point is, I think it's well past time to reform immigration policy on a federal level. There's been runs at this at various times, but that too will give cities and states the kind of support when the federal government puts in place an actual working federal immigration policy plan and system that doesn't buck to them all the big and tough questions. So let me stop there, Kev. I hope that's helpful.
Thanks. That's very helpful, Professor. Mayor Keller, thank you for being with us. We appreciate your time. Albuquerque, as you know, is known as an immigrant-friendly city. I think you passed a resolution a few years ago reaffirming that. I went on your website and saw you have an immigrant and refugee office, which was interesting. Could you just give us an overview of the services the city provides to immigrants and helping them to transition into the Albuquerque community? What do you have available, and how are you able to prioritize that in terms of your resources?
Sure. Well, thank you for that. And it's an honor to be on this panel and also with just some great leaders, both in, of course, the broader Notre Dame community, but also Mayor Margo, who I had the fortune to visit a couple of times down because of this issue in El Paso, a tremendous leader in El Paso, and Dennis, we all know your good work in the White House. So grateful to be with you. And, from a city perspective, of course, everything that I think Dennis mentioned is so important. The cities rarely have the luxury to think about policy. We have to deal with the situation at hand. And I think an example of that was, of course, what happened in 2018 and 2019. So we had a very small Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs office. I mean, it was half an FTE. And I had started to expand it when I came in. And then all of a sudden, the refugee crisis hit with the separation at the border. And for us, this office could not have played a more important role, literally changing lives, saving lives as they pass through our town. So what was happening is basically when folks would come up through the border and be in these camps, they would be, as it was found out, separated from their families. And then as nonprofits tried to find sponsor organizations, they would be funneled to the nearest city that had an airport and a US bus terminal. And so for us, that was Albuquerque. So Albuquerque has always been a crossroads for immigrants and refugees and all sorts throughout our long history. But for us, we would get a couple of hundred folks each day coming up from the border, and we were the point at which they were tried to be, organizations would pair them with then somewhere to go if that didn't happen on the border. So border overflows, and then they show up in Albuquerque. So what happened for us was something I think very extraordinary. You know, our town, still to my surprise, and it makes me grateful to live here, we stepped up for these immigrant and refugee families in a way that was public, in a way that was using taxpayer dollars. So we put hundreds of thousands of dollars into temporary shelters. We opened up public facilities like our state fairgrounds to actually house folks as they came through. And we had, you know, hundreds of volunteers helping feed, do healthcare checkups, and pair these individuals with sponsors, you know, throughout the country. And so this became a way for us, these asylum seekers at that point, they were able to come through Albuquerque with dignity, and we were able to keep them off our streets too. So we didn't have situations like can happen where you have these asylum seekers sort of wandering around bus stations, they don't speak the language, et cetera. And so our office ended up now, I think there was about 12 people, it ballooned in size, to help coordinate this. And so we just played a coordinating role with Catholic Charities, with other institutions, the Archdiocese. We did go officially, I know our Archdiocese actually asked at Communion to donate and help with the asylum seekers in Albuquerque, right? This was a local message. So for us, I mean, it culminated ironically on Easter, literally on Easter Sunday last year, or 2 years ago now. You know, that was the one day where all the volunteers were not volunteering. And so city workers did. Our city workers, we had dozens of people out feeding and shepherding these folks as they came through right during Holy Week. And so I think it was a great message of just outreach and everything that Holy Week is about. And so for us, we actually did this we owned it publicly, and you know, we had very little blowback, I will tell you. You know, surprisingly, I was grateful that there was not a lot of anti-asylum seeker rhetoric or us getting mad about using city resources. Wonderfully, our city kind of all agreed this is just the right thing to do. So that's really what we did. Now, I'll end by just saying that's under the auspice of we're trying to continue to have all things, you know, equity and inclusion. So this is part of a broader effort for us just to say that, you know what, 12% of our city roughly doesn't even speak English. So everything needs to be bilingual. We've got to have access. And we have to remember that these folks need a safe way to take their kids to school, to go to a hospital. And that also means that they can't live in fear of ICE. And so we've been very clear that any kind of roundups or disruption of family units is not welcome in Albuquerque as long as everyone's law abiding.
You mentioned the Archdiocese. We have the participants are advocates, legal service providers online with us. How do you work with faith-based groups and community organizations in Albuquerque to help immigrants and asylum seekers? Can you give us some examples?
Sure. And this was it took us a while to figure out how to do this. Of course, unfortunately, the crisis, one, lasted a long time, but two, it really brought us together. And I would mention Lutheran World Services in our town was them, and Catholic Charities were kind of the two big entities that do this. So, you know, it actually became, we had a morning daily call with everyone who was working, and we would go either family by family or busload by busload or individual. And we would say, okay, Lutherans get these folks, Catholics get these folks, city, we need 10 people to take care of these folks. We need 6 extra hotel rooms. We were using city buses to do this, our shuttles too, to deal with transport to and from the airport. We needed special zones in our airport to interact with these folks so that there wouldn't be issues with media or protesters who were against them, to safely get them in and out in terms of their privacy as individuals. All of that was done much ironically, like now we've been doing with Corona, But it was a morning call, and it was run by our Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs, but the heads of all those agencies were on it. And we would make a game plan for the week and then check in at a staff level until the following week.
So, Mayor, you heard Dennis's recommendations on improving the relationship between the federal government and cities. What do you say the federal government could do to help a city like Albuquerque to help integrate immigrants? What is it that you see the federal government is not doing, or what it could do to help you in your efforts?
I think there's a couple of aspects. One is just to untether a lot of federal funding that can be tied to immigrant status. And it's just a reflection of the fact that, like, if people need housing, you know, let's just get them some kind of housing and not argue over what their status is. And you see this with a lot of federal programs that maybe come with certain ties, even things like food stamps and so forth. So it would be helpful to just untether those and then have that battle in DC or Congress, as opposed to literally at a city who's trying to figure out, I've got federal money, but I can't give it to you. So that's one area I think that would help. We did see, and the system did kind of work, you know, for whatever reason, it did change eventually, but you know, we used to have a heads up, like a day lead time, and we'd hear from, I forget the exact government agency, but the ones, they'd say, you know, we're sending a busload up to Albuquerque. And we'd be like, great, and they'll be here tomorrow. And so we'd have to quickly sort of figure out what to do. A more orderly process, of course, of that happening would be much, much more helpful. And I think the last thing too is, there were different rules too around what you had to do to have a sponsor and that sort of thing. And of course, there's always that judicial piece involved somewhere in the chain. Just lining that up in a methodical approach so that people know where they are in the process and they know what the next step is, and in a language they can understand and that support organizations can understand. That system was just totally overwhelmed. So setting it up so that system can scale effectively would be extremely helpful to prevent what happened before. But I do want to add just one piece around, you know, just the normal dealing that we have with refugees. We have a lot of resettlement through the State Department from countries that are, you know, war-torn and that kind of thing. So Albuquerque is a resettlement location, and that has to do with, it's not just, you know, Mexico. This is resettlements from the Middle East and from Asia and so forth. That actually, I will say, to credit the federal government, that has run smoothly for years. And we need to get them more help and help them integrate better, especially with language. That's the biggest aspect. Language and a job, and then they can take care of themselves. But that area, by and large, we've been doing that since the 70s, since Vietnam, and it's a core part of who we are as a city. Terrific.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions from the audience. The first one is for you, Professor, and it's basically about, you mentioned immigration policy and the need for reform. Let's look into our crystal ball and imagine that there is a Biden administration on January 20th, 2021. The question is, what steps should the administration take to get an immigration reform bill passed with a path to citizenship? What steps should the administration take, first of all? And the second part of the question is, what past mistakes should a new administration and the immigrant community try to learn from and to avoid in this next version of immigration reform? Because we've seen over the last 20 years, we've had immigration reform on the floor 3 or 4 times, and it's always failed. How do we get it over that bar and to the president's desk? What recommendations would you have, both for a prospective President Biden and also for the immigrant advocates in getting that goal and achieving that goal finally after 20, 25 years?
Yeah, well, thanks very much, Kev. And I love hearing that story about the coordination at the local level. It's both ecumenical, but also just kind of straightforward citizens making it work. And I think that's great to hear. And I do look forward to the day when the federal government is making that easier rather than harder. Look, on immigration reform, I just did this event, another event at Notre Dame the other night with Speaker Ryan. And we looked back on 2013, 2014 as a moment. You'll recall that we had gotten a bipartisan package through the Senate with 74 votes. And that's a lot of votes in the Senate. You don't get 74 votes for anything anymore. And they sent it over to the House, and he reported on the conversation we had the other night with your brother, Kevin, that they were actually ready to go to get that done in the House, which they could have done with, simple majority vote. But then the number 2 leader in the Republican caucus, Eric Cantor, was defeated in a primary. And all the Republicans interpreted that to mean, the Republican leadership interpreted that to mean that he was defeated because of his tolerance for immigration reform. So my first bit of advice is to not believe that. I don't believe that the politics on immigration reform are that polarized. In fact, I think it might be the kind of problem solving and institution rebuilding that Washington could do to begin to restore some faith in our cities and in our states, in Washington institutions that have kind of recently demonstrated their incapacity rather than their capacity to take on big challenges. So one is don't be dissuaded. 1. 2, that goes directly to the role for the immigrant advocacy community, which is like, just keep fighting. This is an unbelievably effective group of organizations and individuals. And I can tell you that's the case because we used to have meetings to strategize how to deal with all the advocacy we're going to confront. And so one is so the second point is to the advocates, don't give up and don't let up. Third is time is an issue. And I think the big challenge if President Biden, if there is in fact a President Biden, and I knocked wood there a minute ago and I do it again, there's a lot of challenges to resolve in Washington, starting, I think, with the pandemic and the economic dislocation and the support to cities and states that's necessary as a result of it. After that, there's other challenges: immigration, climate change, which is feeding so much immigration, and healthcare, which is literally life and death. And it looks like the Supreme Court is going to be taking up another case on the Affordable Care Act the second week of November. So the challenge is finding time. And so this is another challenge for the advocacy community to make sure that you push to make sure that this issue gets on the agenda and stays on the agenda until it's done. So those would be my 3 recommended steps.
Very helpful. Thank you. Mayor, we have a 2-part question for you. Your city has also been labeled, I was going to say criticized, but labeled as a sanctuary city, which is a politicized term, and that you don't hold undocumented immigrants generally for ICE, which has caused a lot of division, not just on Albuquerque, but throughout the country in those situations. Has that, as I mentioned, poisoned the well between your city and federal officials? And how have you been able to overcome that in achieving other goals? And then I have a second part of that question. If you answer the first part, I'll give you the second part.
Sure. It's a really astute question, in that the reality, which is hard to ever find, like in a newspaper article, is that, one, we have an ordinance now, which I signed and supported. So it is city law that, like, we have to follow our own law, which is to not permit that. But a lot of federal money comes and says that you have to do that, right? So what happened under this presidential administration is lots of federal monies came with those strings attached. And, it's a little political, movida is a term we use here. You know, I mean, other presidents have done that kind of thing with federal funding. So I would say that what has been somewhat refreshing is that at the local level, we basically get the lawyers in a room and argue over whether or not, you know, one side can make an exemption or something that will sort of let it go through. And most of the time we've been able to do that, meaning the feds will, you know, waive whatever, or they won't object to whatever we've listed that we can't do. And I think that is a glimmer of hope, like for our country, because it's a situation where, you know, in the grand scheme of things, very low level officials at the federal government and at the city sit there and they're like, okay, like, can we make this work? And they write a couple of letters in the appendix and then everyone walks away happy. That's a great thing, right? That's what you want happening in our country. And that actually happens in our town quite often. And so very rarely have we really come to loggerheads, because cooler heads have just prevailed and said that, you know, fighting crime and helping each other is more important.
And the second part, speaking of fighting crime, the question here is that there's been a couple of federal enforcement initiatives in Albuquerque recently, Operation Legend and Operation Relentless Pursuit. What assurance have you gotten from the federal government that these initiatives haven't targeted immigrant families, you know, otherwise law-abiding immigrant families? I know you mentioned immigrant families earlier in your discussion. Have they morphed into more than just fighting crime, fighting drug traffickers, fighting felons in your community, trying to reduce the crime rate? Has it become more of an immigration sweep at times, and how have you tried to prevent that from happening? Well,
this is a really, you know, salient, timely question, and I'll tell you a quick story. There's sort of what goes on with political rhetoric, and then there's like what's actually happening. So in our case, right, this was international news. Albuquerque was mentioned along with Chicago and Kansas City as, you know, one of the recipients of Operation Legend. And that announcement was paired the day after the president, in his own words, said that these programs were about cracking down on protesters and immigrants and so forth. So many of us became obviously very concerned, because in our town, we didn't want that. So we stood up against that kind of rhetoric. And the amazing thing is that actual people who are doing work, as opposed to politicians, they're working together all the time. And I said repeatedly, our city works with the federal government literally every week on all sorts of different operations.
Right.
And also in those operations, we work out on paper, you know, what's fair game and what's not. And in our town, as I mentioned before, this was what I was alluding to. We say like, what's in bounds if you're working with our police department? Immigrant roundups are not, period. And so they actually work it out, and we work together quite often on all sorts of other operations. So we do this though in writing with things like an MOU and, you know, correspondence back and forth. And so interestingly, even with Operation Legend, we had that written correspondence. Now it took about 10 days to get assurances that those dollars or those operations will not go after protesters and will not be immigrant roundups. But we actually got it from our local offices. And once we got that, we said, okay, we're fine to go ahead. So I think it's just a good example where, you know, we were able to work it out. We had to exchange some paperwork, and we had to put the lawyers in the room, and it worked out. But it was literally the words of the president that drove the firestorm, as opposed to the legal operation. Now that's just for our town. I don't want to speak to any other towns, but I would also just mention this, and this happens all the time, but there was a lot of backdating. So the reality is this Operation Legend was just new letterhead for Operation Relentless Pursuit, which was back in January. And then the money was actually something called a COPS grant. It's a community policing, it's just a grant. And so we've been working on the paperwork for this for 6 months. And it was made to sound like it was this new program. And I mean, none of it. It was all just renaming old programs and then, you know, politically saying that it was new to try and take credit for fighting crime. So, I mean, I'm just telling you straight up, like, that was all branding and politics. The reality, fortunately, was much, much better. But we had to air that out in public and then a week later get back to business.
Yeah, it's amazing how politics gets inserted into a lot of these issues. Mayor, I know you have to run. Did you have any final comments for our participants in terms of how they can work with local jurisdictions, cities to better improve integration efforts for immigrants?
Well, I think a couple of ideas just on at the end. You know, one, if different localities don't have a single point of contact, it doesn't have to be an Office of Refugee Affairs, but someone who is at least close enough to the mayor's office to kind of get things done. That just from a operations perspective has come in extremely helpful time and time again. And of course, that person has to have relationships with Catholic Charities and the different nonprofit organizations. So having that in place, and you know how much you use it, it depends on the situation, but having that in place is really important. The second thing is I would create a little space for professionals to get the work done. You know, there was a time even with the separation of families where I had to step back. They're like, you know, Mayor, you're being on camera might actually be slowing us down. It might be hurting what we're trying to do. And I said, sure. And so for like 2 weeks, we didn't even talk about it because we had to get our ducks in a row behind the scenes. And then I think you saw inversely nationally, right? When the US president is talking about Albuquerque, New Mexico, like that's going to create ripples in our town. So I'm better off just talking to the local folks who represent the president, you know. So that would be a second takeaway. And I think the third one is, you know, there is a little bit about faith, and it doesn't have to be a Catholic faith persuasion. I'm actually married, my wife is Jewish, and we have found that it's okay to talk about faith, and it's okay to use that to do good in your community. And politicians shouldn't be afraid of, you know, things like legal issues around separation of church and state. That doesn't mean you can't walk out there and say, I'm asking everyone, if you believe this is the right thing to do, if it's part of your faith calling, we need your help. That's okay to do for people from both parties. And I think that's something that also helped keep us together.
Thank you for that last thought. And yes, faith plays a big part in advocacy these days, both locally and in Washington. So thank you for being with us, Mayor.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, and best of luck to the others. And I'd mentioned too, faith doesn't even have to be religious. It can just be a value that this is the right thing to do. And appreciate this panel. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Okay, Mayor Margo, thank you for your patience and your time. I'm going to ask you some similar questions as I did Mayor Keller, but from a different perspective, a different slightly twist, because you're on the border. You're at ground zero, if you will, of the immigration issue. Your city gets a lot of attention, both wanted and sometimes unwanted, on this issue. And I'm sure as a mayor of a major border city, the issue of immigration is on your weekly agenda, if not your daily agenda. So we're really interested in your perspective. I've in researching for this panel, I've heard you speak eloquently about the community in El Paso. You know, we all know that El Paso went through a horrific tragedy last year, and showed to the world how strong your community is and how supportive it is. Could you talk a little bit about the community there? I know you've lived in El Paso for a long time, and you know it intimately, but it would be helpful to share with the participants the sense of community that is El Paso.
I'd be happy to. Thank you. What I found, we are the largest U.S. city on the Mexican border. And we are a region that's been here for 361 years, since 1659. People don't realize that the bulk of our population was on the south side of the Rio Grande until 1848. And that was when Fort Bliss came to El Paso, and we had some migration north of the Rio Grande. But we are the largest bilingual, binational, bicultural region in the Western Hemisphere. When you take into account Juarez, Mexico, El Paso, and southern New Mexico, we're a population of 2.7 million people and an average age of 31. El Paso is 85% Hispanic, and we have 6 of the bridges that cross between Texas and Mexico. and it's a daily event. We've had, as I say, for over 350 years, families on both sides, culture on both sides, commerce on both sides, and we continue to function that way. The August 23rd tragedy was an attack by an evil white supremacist from 700 miles away who came to attack us as to who we are as a community and as a people. And that was right at the end of the immigration crisis that we went through. You refer to us as Ground Zero. We became known nationally and internationally, and the media has Ground Zero for immigration. Let me talk about our history with that and how that came about. I received a call from the Border Sector Chief for Customs and Border Protection in October of 2018 to alert me that they were overwhelmed in their facilities and could not maintain with ICE any more immigrants, that they were going to have to process those immigrants and then release them into our community. So we immediately began planning. We don't have a separate quote office for immigration. We use our community and human development staff to deal with that. So we marshaled our resources based on our NGO. The primary NGO we used to facilitate this was the Annunciation House. And we worked with others, and we don't do it directly as the city, although we provided transportation, et cetera. And the way it would work is we had an agreement with CBP. And let me explain to your viewers and listeners that the holding areas at that time for Customs and Border Protection and ICE were antiquated single cells designed for, or single holding areas designed for males coming from Mexico. And what you had, because what was promoting all this was the William Wilberforce Anti-Trafficking Victims Act, which was passed under the Bush administration, designed to protect unaccompanied minors coming from Guatemala, El Salvador, and the Honduras through Mexico at the height of the drug cartel wars. And our fear was, as a federal government, it was a magnanimous gesture, was we didn't want these unaccompanied minors to be used in drug trafficking or human trafficking or any of that. So we basically gave unfettered entrance for unaccompanied minors coming from those three countries contiguous to Mexico, but didn't apply to Mexicans. It only applied to those. And the law initially stated that you had to enter at a port of entry. So you'd enter at El Paso's port of entry. And then there were some court cases and litigation that was filed that said, number one, it wasn't only unaccompanied minors, it could be families. And then another court case came down and said, and you can enter anywhere along the border. So that's what created all of a sudden the surge, everybody coming, and everyone was overwhelmed. So CBP calls me and says, we can't handle anymore. ICE can't handle anymore. Our agreement was that they would give us 24-hour notice. The migrants were not staying in El Paso. Typically the process was they would be here at the Annunciation House as our primary NGO for 24 to 48 hours. While there, the volunteers would help feed them and clothe them if they needed help and contact their sponsors. A sponsor could be a family member or a friend, it didn't matter. And they were all over the United States. So for 24 to 48 hours, they would be contacted, processed. The sponsors would pay for bus fare or airfare, and the migrants and their families would depart. That was pretty much the way it was handled. There were many people who had misunderstandings about that. We got into numerous issues, but the real crisis point that put us on the map as infamously being known as Ground Zero was on December the 23rd of 2018. There was a glitch in the notification, and CBP released, without our knowledge, a large number of migrants at our Greyhound bus station here. And all of a sudden, the following week prior to Christmas and then or during the week of Christmas and New Year's, I was on the news with CNN, all the national news, Fox, MSNBC, worldwide, to talk about this immigration crisis. We did the best we could to handle it. We were having, as it progressed through the early part of 2019, we were having as many as 700 a day. We had issues similar to what some of them went to Albuquerque. We had some we would try to send to San Antonio. There were limitations as to what ICE would do in the way of travel and bus. We had all sorts. We had to marshal resources. Our county hospital district was involved in any treatment for health issues with any of them. And that's basically what we did. I mean, my wife and grandchildren, we fed them on the weekends. We all did it. Our community came out. We didn't have any issues related. We have a very magnanimous, we're an open community that's, as I say, we're basically all migrants, if you really want to look at it. And we've had families on both sides and multi-generational families that live here. So the big issue was the logistics and the capacity and helping them and get situated. And we had problems on the bridges because CBP removed personnel from the bridges to man the border. And so we had all kinds of local issues on transportation back and forth. And the bridge waits became, from a commerce standpoint with trucks, as long as 11 hours. There were 4 hours on private passenger vehicles coming back and forth. I mean, you've got to understand, we've got 50,000 El Pasoans that work in Juarez on a daily basis. We got 60,000 U.S. residents in Juarez that come north. We had 5,000 to 6,000 students that come north every day for our public school system. And we had at the University of Texas, El Paso, over 1,000 students coming in and attending UTEP. So we had all kinds of logistical problems because of the movement of Border Patrol personnel, but we seemed to work through it. We had, I won't get into it, we had environmental issues because of trucks idling in neighborhoods where the bridges were, it's all that. But all of that seemed to subside about July of 2019. Every day I would receive a text message, and I think Mayor Keller was talking about they were having meetings every day. There was a group of us that received text messages every day based on the number of migrants that were going to be released. Our Emergency Operations Center helped Annunciation House expand their facilities to where they could handle 1,500 migrants in their facilities. We had other volunteer organizations, NGOs that would be involved, and we were just all kind of participating together. The city provided as much as we could in the way of financial resources for food and basics. We provided the bus transportation, and again, the healthcare issues through our county hospital that we needed. But all of a sudden that ended. That ended on my last text for any size was on July 3rd of 2019. And then the next thing we have is the August 3rd shooting at our Walmart, and we go from there. But overall, I thought we as a community did as well as we could. Our biggest, as I talk about, people don't know where we are. I have to explain to national news that we're due south of Albuquerque, largest U.S. city on the Mexican border. I brought out 30 mayors, including Mayor Keller, during the height of the immigration crisis, and took them to the top of one of our bank buildings. And I mean, we had the mayor of Los Angeles, the mayor of New York, and in between 30 of them. Took them to the top of the bank building and pointed south, and I said, tell me where El Paso ends and Juarez begins. Not one of them could decide where it was. That's the uniqueness of where we are. I think people in their minds think we're like San Diego. It's 15, 20 miles away. It is not. We have been one region for over 350 years, as I said earlier. And that's why I took it very personal for what happened on August the 3rd. And it was an attack on who we are. But I can't say enough about our community as a whole. We have come together. We all responded. We volunteered. There was food given. Restaurants brought meals. I remember we went out and bought soccer balls and hoodies and things like that for the kids to be able to be properly equipped while they were here, and then have some fun and then move on. But that all ended. And I don't think, to answer a question that you didn't ask, but that you mentioned with Mayor Keller, is immigration reform is critical to resolve all of this. Nothing has been done for over 30 years. I've spoken about that when I was given the platform because of our immigrant being noted as ground zero for immigration. It's the responsibility of both houses of Congress and both political parties, and neither side has had the intestinal fortitude to do anything in over 30 years. And it needs to be done. You know, they used to talk. I had about a 6 or 8 point talk I give, but the big point was we used to have politically. They'd say, well, we can't do immigration reform until we have border security. And my position was, well, fine, give that to Homeland Security, have them define border security, and give them the resources to implement. Remove that. DACA, I cannot get over. If you serve in the military, and most of we have lots of DACA kids here, and most of them, a great percentage of them, don't even speak Spanish. They've been raised on this side, educated on this side, and are productive young people. And many of them have served in the military. And yet I find out that going back to the 90s, we have made it tougher on DACA, on students who are DACA children who served in the military, which to me, it ought to be axiomatic. You defend our country, you ought to get citizenship if that's what you want. So we need to deal with that. We need to deal with H-2 visas. We can't keep reducing them. I understand today that they came out, the president came out and said they're going to reduce the number of immigrants for next year. We got to do something about the 10 to 12 million we say that have been here for many, many years, and for the most part as productive contributors to our economies, yet they're not legal. We need to figure out what we can do. We need to take away, my position is you vet them for criminal offenses. Those that have, you can deport, but those that haven't, you provide them the opportunity to obtain green cards, but take away that political argument about, well, they're going to be voters. Just most of them are not here to become citizens and vote. They're here for economic opportunity for their families. And that's the big driver. That's what we are. And that gives us, and we should be proud of that they want to come here for that. And I really think that ought to bring back the Bracero program. Bracero program ended in, I think, 64, 68 when Johnson had his New Society programs and everything came in. And the Bracero program, for your participants who don't understand, was designed to allow Mexican agricultural workers to come into the United States during the harvest, work, receive funds, and then go back to Mexico free and clear, and then come back the next time. Well, what's happening now is they're coming over to work the fields because their families need the resources, but they're not going back because they're fearful they can't get back in once they go. And so the system, I have stronger language, but the system needs to be totally revamped. And somebody's got to develop some intestinal fortitude.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, the agricultural worker question has actually been a stumbling block in a lot of the debates as to how that would look, with some farm worker advocates saying you can't have a system like that where it's temporary because the workers get exploited. They need to come in as immigrants, as legal permanent residents. But we did it from 1948 to 1964, as I recall. It worked. And it was ended because of abuses, but that's been a sticking point, which will be a challenge if Congress returns to the issue. A couple of questions from the audience for you, Mayor, if that's okay.
Okay.
I'm trying to interpret this one. Essentially, El Paso may be different from other cities in that you have an intensive federal immigration law enforcement presence, with the Border Patrol, CBP, ICE, all along the border. And how does that infringe upon El Paso's ability to welcome immigrants to the community? Does it change how the community responds to immigrants? I think, in other words, what they're saying is, you have how do you reconcile your sign that says "Welcome to El Paso" when there's another sign put up by the federal government, "Keep out of the United States"? And we've seen that most recently with the shutdown in asylum claims, the Remain in Mexico program, which is another controversial program that has led to migrants being in danger in Mexico. But how do you balance that? I mean, you've got a big federal enforcement presence. Are there times where you just say to them, no, we're not doing this. This is harmful to the community. I want to protect our residents. I want to preserve our community. This is going too far.
Our Customs and Border Protection work the border, and they're not within our city seeking undocumented. Now, we are not a sanctuary city. If our police department arrests a criminal, someone in the act of a criminal event, and they are undocumented, we will report that. But we have not had the issues that I keep hearing about on the quote sanctuary cities and all those others. The Customs and Border Protection, ICE, they're not out doing raids in our community. We don't have those issues. And I've never seen those issues, and I don't get any complaints about that. They're along the border protecting, you know, we are a sovereign nation, and we have a border. Some of us have been involved. I've been involved with Mayor Cabada in Juarez and the business community in Juarez. Mexico doesn't have the growth or the NGO setup that we have in the United States. So we've been trying to help them to be able to deal with those, especially on the Remain in Mexico issues. But again, I go back to the fact that we're not processing. I was doing some analysis of the immigration judges on how many cases they were handling. And the average was, as I recall from last year when I was inquiring, was that they were given caseloads of where somewhere around 700 cases a year. And I'm saying, wait a minute, I'd have 700 coming in one day. So we needed more immigration judges. We needed a higher productivity level there so that we could deal with those that are seeking asylum and that should be granted. So, you know, to me, the issues are still the bureaucracy and the failure of our lawmakers to reconcile this. It's a political football and the proverbial kick the can, and it's been going on for over 30 years. But I don't have harassment issues being brought to my attention. And as I say, we're trying to help those in Juarez establish. We have a lot of people that go both sides to help from an NGO standpoint, especially with those that have been camped out at the bridges in Juarez, waiting to try to get asylum.
So let's put enforcement aside for a second. And you're kind enough to be on the whole hour, and you heard the discussion in the first half hour. What, in your view, can the federal government do to help you and to assist immigrants and refugees to integrate into your community, to become part of the community, whether that be civics instruction or in English or more social services available? Can the federal government help in that area as opposed to just arresting people? I mean, what would you say to the federal government that could help you in welcoming immigrants and making sure they're full members of your community?
Well, it'd be like they're doing on the CARES Act, but I'd like more flexibility for the CARES Act and how we spend those dollars. Mm-hmm. You can always use that, but we really integrate our community pretty well. I mean, as I say, we're 85% Hispanic. There's a predominance of the Spanish language being taught here. I mean, being spoken here. Most everybody is bilingual and capable of doing, you know, that. We don't really have a lot of issues. In fact, if an immigrant comes in, you can't tell that the immigrant's not a member of our regular population. So, I mean, that's just the nature of who we are from a demographic standpoint. Mm-hmm. Which makes us special and unique, and what I love about El Paso. And, you know, I'm married to a third generation El Pasoan, and my grandchildren are fifth generation El Pasoans. So it's just, you know, we can always use financial resources. We don't have a lot of corporate headquarters. Our tax base it's kind of upside down on the residential versus commercial. Those are the things I have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. The COVID has affected us. COVID is one thing you're not addressing, but because of our Hispanic population, we're the most vulnerable. We have a lot of issues. I just got through doing I do a weekly press conference on our COVID status and where we are. But for the most part, we're maintaining I'm pushing hard on the masks and the distancing and the hygiene. So we think for the most part we're doing it, but we have a high incidence of death. The underlying causes are hypertension and diabetes, which is indigenous to our population and our demographics. So we have, the health issues are big, but we do a lot. I've done joint, we have a sister city relationship with Juarez. We've had joint council meetings with the mayor and council of Juarez. They've come over here and we've had joint meetings. We've worked together as well as we can. And we understand that we are intrinsically tied by families and by our economy.
Mayor, we have about 3 minutes, but there's another question here in responding to your comments on the Bracero program. I'll read it verbatim. It says the Bracero program had both positive and negative aspects, and a modern day version of this program would have to address the myriad injustices that characterize that legacy program. How might you expect business leaders in your city to react to such a program, and what reaction might you expect from your constituents?
I think a Bracero program will be received. I know the issues that people talked about. They talked about the housing issues. They talked about the hours worked and the pay. Those are the big three items that people talked about, the conditions of work and where they were staying and how, and there were some regulations. I think we can work through that. I mean, it is critical to our economy to have the workers. How many times during this COVID did we talk about, because the restaurants were shut down, that farmers were plowing under their crops? And so, I think we can figure it out. I know that there were challenges and problems, and there were bad actors, and but I'm optimistic given what I know with people needing the work, those that need the work, and those that need the workers. I think we can figure it out.
And let me just, this is my question. You mentioned that a lot of migrants come just to work and not necessarily to stay, but there are those who do want to become U.S. citizens. And I ask you this because it's a question that has been debated and disagreed on in immigration reform debates is, do you support a path to citizenship for those who may want to remain and become U.S. citizens? Because some in the Republican Party have argued, no, we're just going to give them legal status. And others argue, no, that would create a permanent underclass. You want to be able to allow them to earn citizenship. Is that something that you would support? Or
I served in the, well, I spent 35 years as a CEO. I did serve in our Texas legislature, even though I'm not really a politico per se. I learned that to pass legislation of big importance, you do it incrementally. And given the fact that the issue is that really, frankly, nothing's been done, if incrementally we could get agreement that those undocumented workers or people who've been in the United States for many years, using false Social Security numbers, doing all of that, if there is a way to get them legal from the standpoint of green cards and labor, that would be the first step. Then you figure out what you want to do on those who want citizenship. I don't think we could get it passed, given the volatile nature of politics these days, if you don't do it incrementally. And so my position would be, I don't have a problem with that. I mean, I'm in a community with lots of immigrants, lots of folks who become citizens, lots of them who were part of the amnesty under Reagan. I mean, I understand. And my position would be, though, from a legislative process, let's do it incremental. Let's not do omnibus. That rarely works.
A lot of people agree with that assessment, Mayor. Mayor, we're at the end of our time, and we thank you very much for your service and for your time with us today and for your insights.
My pleasure. Thank you.
That wraps up our session today. It's been a long day, I know, at the conference, but a very productive one, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow morning, I believe, at 8 a.m. for the lecture by Cardinal Cherney. And thank you for being here.